Racist police. Shoot Army Lieutenant Colonel. Pentagon Angry. Policeman Executed. A soldier can survive gunfire on the battlefield, but still be shot while holding a phone in his own country, just because of the color of his skin. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. On a Friday afternoon amid autumn, golden sunlight streamed through rows of maple trees in the Oakmont suburbs of Virginia. The air was fresh, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and the soft rustling of leaves with every breeze. It seemed to promise a quiet, peaceful evening. But no one could have predicted that this seemingly tranquil place was about to become the center of a national tragedy. Inside a sleek black Lexus ES 350, Felix Thompson, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, just returning from an assignment at the Pentagon, was on his way to his mother's home. He had served the U.S. military for nearly 3 decades, leading battalions in campaigns across Fallujah, Afghanistan, and the Syrian border. Throughout his career, he earned 3 meritorious service medals and was once nominated for colonel before choosing to step back to spend more time with his family. Felix was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone commanded respect across any command hall. The Tag Heuer watch on his wrist didn't speak of luxury, but was a gift from his unit after a humanitarian relief mission in Sudan. Every detail about him radiated confidence, integrity, and dignity. Driving from the airport toward the gated neighborhood of Summit Ridge, where his mother, Martha Thompson, had lived since his father passed away, Felix made a quick stop at Magnolia and Finch Bakery. He picked up a strawberry mousse cake, the kind his mother always mentioned around the holidays. For an elderly woman nearing 80, living alone, it was a small gift filled with warmth. Summit Ridge was an affluent, tightly secured community. According to the most recent census, 98.4% of its residents were white, with a per capita income exceeding $350,000 per year. BMW, Porsches, and Mercedes lined the pristine streets, where every lawn looked as trimmed as a billiard table. Felix had been here dozens of times, but this time, everything changed the moment he turned onto Willow Lane. Through his rearview mirror, Felix spotted a local police patrol car trailing closely behind. The white-gray Ford Interceptor didn't activate its siren, nor did it announce anything over a speaker, but the red and blue lights began to flash, a signal to pull over. Felix exhaled gently. He was used to being stopped. In Germany, during a NATO conference, a military police officer had checked his documents, mistaking him for an unauthorized guest. In Tokyo, he had been asked to open his bag at a hotel entrance because security staff assumed he wasn't a guest. And in Washington itself, he had once been pulled over simply for unusually slow driving in the upscale Georgetown neighborhood. He understood, and it pained him, that being a successful black man in America came with a price: constant suspicion. However, this time, something felt different. The patrol car didn't broadcast a message. The officer didn't step out right away. Felix felt a chill pierce his chest, despite the 73-degree Fahrenheit temperature outside. Slowly, he rolled his window down by 1/3, turned off the engine, and placed his hands on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 o'clock positions, just as he had taught young soldiers. In the mirror, he saw the officer get out of the car. The way the man slammed the door, forceful, deliberate. The way he kept his hand near the holster, unmistakably threatening. And most of all, the look in his eyes. Not professional, not cautious, but cold, contemptuous, thick with prejudice, as if what he saw before him wasn't a soldier coming home to visit his mother, but a stranger to be checked, controlled, and subdued. Felix felt his stomach tighten, not from fear, but from the realization that, in that moment, he had just been stopped, in the very country he had sworn to protect with his life. Boniface Hansen was not an unfamiliar name in the internal files of the Oakmont Police Department. At 44 years old, with 17 years of service, he had once been described by a former commander as the kind of officer who never backs down, even when he should. With his high and tight blonde haircut, narrow eyes, and jaw that always clenched slightly under tension, Hansen didn't impress people with integrity, but with a rigidity that carried unsettling undertones. On paper, his record seemed decent. Hansen had received 3 commendations for rapid on-scene response and had played a role in solving a vehicle theft case in downtown Oakmont back in 2016. But what the public reports didn't reveal were more than 12 anonymous complaints filed over the past 7 years, at least 4 of which involved allegations of racial discrimination. One notable incident involved a young African student, whom Hansen allegedly called a street rat, pretending to be an intellectual, while the student was parked outside the library in 2019. The case was reported to superiors, but eventually dismissed due to lack of evidence. Less than 5 months earlier, Hansen had drawn his weapon on a 12-year-old black boy playing with a water gun in his grandmother's front yard. In his report, Hansen claimed the black object in the child's hand resembled a real firearm, and that the boy failed to comply with commands to drop the weapon. But footage from a doorbell camera showed the boy standing still, hands raised, while Hansen advanced with his gun already chambered. The incident narrowly avoided tragedy, but was closed with a cold official statement. Insufficient grounds to open an investigation. Boniface Hansen grew up in Marlow County, often referred to as the White Belt of the state. His family came from a working-class background, and his father, Vernon Hansen, had once been a member of a group advocating for the preservation of Euro-American heritage, which had been classified as a far-right extremist organization. As a teenager, Boniface had been found frequenting an online forum called True American Sons, a gathering place for those spreading the idea that America belongs to white people. When he applied to join the force, he scrubbed his social media history, and no one looked closely. Hansen never made overtly racist remarks in the presence of media, but a later investigation by the Oakmont Gazette revealed that several former colleagues described how he frequently said things like, "Black people shouldn't be where they don't belong," or "A brown guy in a Lexus, guaranteed he's got something in the trunk." Back then, they thought he was joking, until no one could laugh anymore. That afternoon, when Felix Thompson appeared in his Virginia-plated Lexus, Hansen immediately drew his conclusion. Doesn't add up. Black, luxury car, out-of-state plates, not a local. Without a warrant, without calling it in, he turned the wheel, spun the car around, and followed. According to patrol protocol, such actions must be reported to dispatch. He didn't. It was an arbitrary, unlawful decision. But more dangerous than the act itself was the motive behind it. Bias, not suspicion. Hansen activated the flashing lights, didn't run the plates, and didn't announce himself via speaker. The procedure never crossed his mind. He didn't activate his body camera, a mandatory action when engaging with civilians. That failure would later become critical evidence against him, but in that moment, the only thing Boniface Hansen cared about was control. He didn't see a lieutenant colonel, didn't see a son visiting his mother, didn't see a citizen. He saw a threat, as defined by his worldview, shaped by a lifetime of unchecked prejudice. And in Hansen's mind, that threat had to be dealt with before anything could happen, even if that anything only existed in his imagination. With that mindset, he stepped out of the vehicle, not carrying the law, but armed with bias. The black Lexus ES350 sat motionless beneath a canopy of maple trees, its engine turned off since the red and blue lights began flashing behind it. Inside the car, Felix Thompson sat upright, his hands positioned precisely at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, a textbook posture he had taught American soldiers in Iraq for handling suspicious stop scenarios in conflict zones. But today, the one being stopped was high, not in Baghdad, but in a peaceful American neighborhood, in the very country he had sworn to defend with his last breath. Felix wore a navy sports jacket over a white dress shirt, dark khaki trousers, and a pair of Johnston & Murphy loafers he reserved for weekends. No uniform, no rank displayed. But every movement radiated the discipline forged over 28 years of military service. The man stepping out of the patrol car wore the badge of the Oakmont Police Department. But Felix saw clearly, this was no routine stop. The way Hansen approached, his hand close to his holster, was no different than someone stepping onto a battlefield with Felix as the target. There was no greeting, no rank or name introduced, no stated reason for the stop, all required by Article 4.2 of the Citizen Interaction Protocol. There was only a cold question from the man bearing the symbol of law. "What are you doing here?" Felix turned his head calmly, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Visiting my mother," he replied, voice low and firm. "She lives on Oak Lane just past the hill. Here are my registration and license." Hansen took the documents, glanced briefly, then smirked. Not a friendly smile, but the condescending curl of the lips Felix had seen many times as one of the few black officers at international military conferences. "Virginia, huh? That's quite a drive," Hansen said, drawing out the southern accent deliberately. "Folks from out of town usually come here for a reason. Like scoping out the mansions, maybe hoping someone forgot to lock a door." At that moment, Felix felt the blood surge to his temples. His heart didn't race from fear, but from a wave of fury rising like a storm tide. He knew this line of questioning no longer fell within the bounds of reasonable suspicion. This was an interrogation wrapped in insult, no different than being questioned by someone with power, but without the ethics to wield it justly. He remained composed. "I'm a United States citizen," he said. "I have no obligation to explain myself during an unlawful stop." Hansen didn't respond. Instead, he tapped on the window 3 times. "Knock, knock, knock!" A sound sharp and aggressive, like tapping a baton against a jail cell door. He leaned in, face nearly pressed against the glass, voice low but unmistakably threatening. "Step out of the vehicle. I suspect you have weapons. Or drugs." In that instant, Felix knew the situation had shifted. This man wasn't seeking cooperation. He was looking for an excuse to escalate. In the military, Felix had made life or death decisions within seconds. And now, that skill was being called upon once more. He understood that any uncontrolled reaction could become justification for reckless action. But he also knew excessive compliance only enabled abuse. Felix drew a deep breath. "I have nothing illegal on me. If you have a warrant, I'll cooperate. If not, I request that you end this stop immediately." Hansen sneered. "Don't need a warrant if I've got probable cause." "And what's your probable cause?" Felix asked in return. That question pierced the armor of pride and false virtue Hansen wore like a pin through fabric. He had no answer. And that made him more dangerous than ever. Because when a man with a weapon feels challenged, the first thing he loses control of isn't his actions. It's his ego. The afternoon breeze whispered through the copper-red maple leaves, carrying with it fallen fragments like silent letters from autumn scattered along the pavement. Felix stood beside his Lexus ES 350, the glossy black finish glinting under the setting sun, facing a police officer slowly unraveling. The car door he'd just stepped out of remained ajar. He stood upright, both arms relaxed at his sides. No sudden movements, no threatening gestures. His posture, calm, deliberate, was not that of a suspect, but of a man who still believed in law and order, even as injustice breathed hot against his face. "What do you plan to do next?" Felix asked, his voice even. Not raised, not trembling, but firm like a command he had once given on the battlefield in Ramadi. Boniface Hansen didn't answer with words, but with action. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt, the metal clinking with a dry, chilling sound, like a silent proclamation of force. He stepped forward, slowly, threateningly, his eyes no longer restrained, but laced with raw hostility. "You have no right to detain me without a specific cause," Felix continued, standing his ground, gaze unwavering. "No violation, no weapon, no clear reason. If you don't have a search warrant, I will call my attorney now." Felix's words, neither shouted nor provocative, cut deep into Hansen's fragile ego. From the moment he saw the gleaming Lexus and the brown-skinned man stepping out, Hansen had seen Felix as a threat. But when Felix began speaking with logic, law, and self-control, he felt challenged, resisted, something that, in Hansen's mind, a black man had no right to do. "Fucking camouflaged black boy," he hissed through clenched teeth, then sneered with a tired phrase passed down by those clinging to fading white power. "You people think a little status means you can do something?" Felix drew a slow breath. He knew the air could ignite at any second, if either side crossed the line. But he also knew silence was exactly what injustice fed on. So he decided to reach for his phone. Not to record for attention, not to intimidate, as defenders of police misconduct often claimed, but to document the truth. To protect himself with the only weapon he had left: evidence. He spoke first. "I will record this entire exchange, and I'm calling my lawyer." Then, calmly, very slowly, he moved his right hand into the inner pocket of his navy blue blazer. His fingers touched the black leather case of his iPhone 12 Pro Max, the very device he once used to call the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon during emergency briefings. But in Hansen's eyes clouded with panic, ego, and fear of losing control, that movement was the spark. "Gun! Gun!" Hansen screamed, not waiting to see what was being pulled out. In less than 0.7 seconds, he drew his Glock 19 from its holster, raised it. No warning, no verification, no adherence to any standardized civilian engagement protocol. And he pulled the trigger. The 9mm round left the barrel at 375 meters per second, slicing through the silent air and slamming into the lower left abdomen of Felix, who stood barely 2 meters away. The impact didn't make Felix cry out, just a soft breath, as if the wind inside him had been severed. His hand loosened, the phone slipped from his grasp, spun once in the air, then hit the pavement beside his blood-speckled loafer. Felix stumbled back, bumping into the side of the Lexus. His eyes widened, filled with disbelief, not from pain, but from the sheer absurdity of the moment. The eyes of a man who had just realized he wasn't even seen as human in the eyes of the man before him. He collapsed. One knee hit the ground. Then his entire body gave way. Blood began to spill from the wound, a vivid red spreading across the pale concrete, as if accusing the very land that once claimed to be the home of the free. And the phone, the witness to truth, the right to be heard, lay silently beside a growing pool of blood. In a matter of seconds, that scene shattered the illusion of peace in Summit Ridge. A soldier had fallen, not for war, not for duty, but because a phone was mistaken for a gun. In the moment after the gunshot, the world seemed to hold its breath. No sirens, no running footsteps. No one screamed, "We need medical help." Instead, only the sound of rustling wind and blood dripping onto the pavement remained, an eerie silence far more haunting than the gunfire itself. Boniface Hansen stood there, his body still leaning forward as if ready to shoot again. His breath was ragged. His hand clutching the Glock had not relaxed, and sweat streamed down his temples and soaked the back of his collar. A rush of adrenaline surged through his brain, not from imminent danger, but from fear. Fear of being found out. Within less than a minute after the shot, Hansen did not check for a pulse, did not approach the dying man, did not attempt CPR, nor initiate any emergency medical alert. He did what the guilty often do when cloaked in power. He tried to control the narrative. Hansen circled back to the patrol car, turned on the radio, and for the first time that afternoon, transmitted an official communication. "This is Unit 7AM2. Suspect was non-compliant, resisted commands, pulled an object resembling a weapon from his jacket. I was forced to discharge my firearm in self-defense, requesting medical aid and Level 3 response unit." His voice, heard over the radio alone, might have sounded composed, but the internal recording system at dispatch captured his labored breathing and faltering words, like someone straining to read from a prepared script. Even more telling, Hansen deliberately gave a false location for the incident. Instead of Willow Lane and Summit Drive, he stated Maple and Brookside, a residential area more than half a mile away. And after saying, "object resembling a weapon," he muted the mic for 3 seconds, a common trick to erase or revise parts of a transmission. Later, the department's audio engineers confirmed the sudden mic drop was no technical glitch. It was intentional. But Hansen didn't know that, during that time, 3 residents had already called 911, and their initial statements completely contradicted Hansen's report. A 74-year-old woman, living just 50 meters from the scene, called dispatch and trembled as she said, "I heard the officer yelling, then a loud gunshot. I didn't hear anyone shoot back, didn't hear any threats." Another witness, Roger Mayfield, 61, clearly stated during his call, "I was in my kitchen, looking out the north window. The black man was shot right after he pulled something from his pocket, but it was a phone." The most striking detail came from a child. 9-year-old Malik Turner, watching from the 2nd floor of his house, later drew the scene in his evening journal using colored pencils, a man collapsing, a large black phone beside his hand, and next to him, a police officer with a smoking gun. That drawing, seemingly simple, was later displayed during a congressional hearing on police violence at Capitol Hill. Meanwhile, it took 4 full minutes after Felix collapsed for the first ambulance to arrive at the scene. When the EMTs lowered the stretcher, Felix was still breathing, weakly, heavily, but alive. His eyes flickered open, lips trying to form words, but blood had risen in his throat. When the lead nurse tried to retrieve the victim's phone to gather his information and contact next of kin, Hansen stopped her. He insisted that it's a dangerous piece of evidence and must be secured by police, even though regulations allow medical personnel to access personal items for identification in emergency cases. But what Hansen couldn't stop was the truth lying in Felix's wallet. When Sergeant Alvaro Ramirez, a 22-year veteran and former U.S. Marine, checked Felix's back pocket for identification, he pulled out a thick, worn but clean brown leather wallet. Inside were a citizen ID, a few family photos, an insurance card, and a white card with embossed print and dark blue borders, bearing the emblem of the Pentagon. Ramirez froze, his flashlight illuminating the bold text. United States Department of Defense, Active Duty Identification. Name, Felix A. Thompson. Rank, Lieutenant Colonel, 05. Branch, U.S. Army, Pentagon Division. He said nothing, just stared at the card in his hand trembling not from fear, but from understanding the magnitude of what had just happened. A senior officer of the United States military, shot down on a street. No weapon, no threat, only a lie. And it was all just beginning. 29 minutes. That was all it took from the moment Sergeant Ramirez discovered the military ID in Felix Thompson's wallet for news of the shooting to break through every layer of administrative red tape, fly past chains of command, and land squarely on the desk of one of the most powerful men in the Pentagon, General Gavin Harrison, Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army, a man who had once commanded over 90,000 troops in the Middle East, a man long referred to as a pillar of national security. That night, General Harrison was at NORAD's command base in Colorado Springs, attending a top-secret briefing on global air defense strategy. He wasn't traveling with many aides, but when his phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Felix shot. Police. Civilian. His face froze like a bronze statue in the warm-lit room. Without a word, he left the meeting room, carrying only a data tablet. 12 minutes later, a UH-72A Lakota helicopter piloted by the VIP Rapid Deployment Team lifted him directly toward the Pentagon. A journey that usually required 24 hours of advance clearance, he completed in under 1. At 10:41 p.m., the Department of Defense headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, lit up the entire 8th and 9th floors. Within the next 45 minutes, 17 high-level calls were placed to the Governor of Virginia, the FBI Director, the Attorney General, the Chair of the National Security Council, and the White House's legal advisor. The final call of the night came directly from General Harrison. He dialed the U.S. Attorney General with a simple message. "We will not let a soldier die unjustly in silence. No one gets to walk away from this. No one." Less than 2 hours after the gunshot, the Department of Defense drafted and submitted an emergency petition demanding that the Federal Inspector General launch a civil rights investigation, citing potentially racially motivated homicide, constitutional violations, and abuse of civilian power over an active duty service member. The file included 11 preliminary pieces of evidence: crime scene photos, residential camera footage, emergency medical reports, and a copy of the military identification card. By 1 a.m., the story had leaked. First, a few lines on internal military forums, then confirmation by a source at the Washington Sentinel. And within just 3 hours, what had been a shadowed incident in an affluent neighborhood exploded into the national spotlight. CNN, NBC, Reuters, and BBC America all aired emergency bulletins. Images from the scene: a black man lying face down on the pavement, next to a blood-stained phone, blurred slightly but clear enough for the public to know he wasn't carrying a weapon. Veterans groups began to mobilize. The Gulf War Veterans Association sent a direct protest letter to the mayor of Oakmont. Veterans for Justice launched an online campaign on civic action. Within the first 6 hours, it had gathered over 51,000 signatures, demanding an independent criminal investigation. Veterans from 38 states posted video testimonials, all repeating one line: "I wore the same uniform Felix did." A new hashtag surged on X, formerly Twitter: #Justice for Felix. Within 8 hours of the incident, it reached the top 3 nationwide trends, alongside political and global crisis topics. Under each post were thousands of comments not only filled with rage, but grief. He was my son. He was my former squad mate. He was me if I'd pulled out my phone that day. In Oakmont, the atmosphere shifted from calm to chaos. The local mayor, a conservative-leaning former businessman, was woken at 1:37 a.m. by a storm of calls from the state governor, the city council president, and the chief of staff of the FBI's Virginia office. An emergency meeting was convened at 2 a.m., lacking full legal documentation, without any media advisors, and with no one in the room fully prepared to face the magnitude of the unfolding storm. This was no longer Oakmont's story, no longer just Felix's family's burden. This had become America's reckoning. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Pentagon chose to speak in a voice that could not be ignored. If the law has been bent, we will bend it back into place. Less than 14 hours after Lieutenant Colonel Felix Thompson drew his final breath at Oakmont Medical Center, the city's police department, once a fortress of silence and internal shielding, began to crack. Pressure from the media, military officials, and most of all, the public, left no room for evasion. Boniface Hansen, the officer who pulled the trigger, was officially placed on administrative leave at 6:27 a.m. the next morning, per an urgent announcement by Police Chief David Mathers. At an internal press briefing, Mathers delivered a statement lasting only 53 seconds, but every word was sharpened for clarity. The officer involved in the shooting of a civilian is now under criminal investigation. His access to equipment, personal files, and authorization for use of force tools has been revoked immediately. Shortly after, Oakmont's Internal Investigations Agency, IIA, typically responsible for isolated misconduct complaints, was joined by the FBI and, most notably, the U.S. Army's CID, Criminal Investigation Division, a federal unit that oversees crimes involving military personnel. The Army's direct involvement in a civilian police shooting of an active duty soldier was unprecedented in Virginia over the past 3 decades. The Joint Task Force's preliminary report quickly revealed serious irregularities. Hansen's body cam had been deactivated just before he exited his patrol vehicle, violating Section 5.7 of the Code on Recording Device Usage. According to system logs, the camera was manually shut off exactly 11 minutes before the shot was fired. There were no signs of a struggle. The bullet entered from above, striking directly into Felix's left abdomen, suggesting he was standing still, not crouching, not resisting. No weapon was recovered from the scene. Aside from a blood-streaked black iPhone lying near the victim's right hand, there was nothing suspicious. No sweat traces, no DNA, but Felix's in the vehicle. This completely refuted Hansen's initial claim of an altercation inside the car. Most critically, forensic experts retrieved a 2-minute and 18-second audio recording from Felix's phone. In it, his voice was calm, clear, repeating multiple times, "I am being stopped without cause. I will call my lawyer." Just before Hansen's scream of, "Draw your weapon!" the recording captured the sound of a zipper and rapid knocking on glass, details that perfectly aligned with eyewitness testimony. 6 resident statements were collected within 48 hours. 3 witnesses confirmed they heard no resistance or threats from the victim. An 82-year-old man recounted, "I was watching from my balcony." He stepped out of the car calmly. "I remember clearly," he asked, "what are you planning to do next?" And then, there was just a bang. Under mounting media pressure, District Attorney Isabella Rossi, a legal veteran with over 15 years of experience prosecuting cases of police abuse, appeared at a 10 a.m. Sunday press conference. In her hands was a 117-page preliminary report. Her face was unreadable as she spoke a single, measured sentence. "We will prosecute him to the fullest extent of both state and federal law." Immediately afterward, the FBI confirmed to the press that a federal civil rights investigation had been launched, a rare but necessary move, especially given that the victim was an active duty officer in the United States Army. A spokesperson stated, "We have identified clear indicators of racial bias in both the officer's conduct and his decision to use force." At the same time, the U.S. Army announced that CID would maintain an on-site supervisory presence throughout the investigation to ensure transparency and fairness, a level of oversight seldom seen in local criminal proceedings. At Oakmont Police Headquarters, Boniface Hansen, the man who once saw himself as untouchable, now sat isolated in a private room, stripped of access to firearms, communications devices, or personnel. During his first interrogation, which lasted over 5 hours, Hansen repeated the same familiar phrase, "I felt threatened. I had to act." But this time, no one believed him. because the truth was now being rewritten by blood, by audio, by living testimony, and by a rising fury beyond the precinct walls. And from that moment on, one fact became undeniable. Boniface Hansen had run out of exits. On November 27th, exactly 6 weeks after the shooting that claimed the life of Lieutenant Colonel Felix Thompson, the Oakmont County Supreme Court convened what many referred to as the justice trial of postmodern America. This wasn't merely a case of a police officer pulling the trigger. It was a mirror held up to expose the rotten core of institutional protectionism, where justice had to confront its own shadow. The atmosphere outside the courthouse resembled a war zone. More than 170 security personnel, including FBI agents and military police, were deployed to maintain order. Over 800 Oakmont residents gathered outside the gates, holding banners that read, "Justice for Felix. One uniform, one blood. He served. They killed." Police erected 3 layers of metal barricades around the courthouse grounds and strictly limited media access within a 300-foot radius. Nearly 30 international news outlets were present, including the New York Times, BBC World, Al Jazeera, CNN, MSNBC, and Reuters. The presence of human rights organizations such as the NAACP, Human Rights Watch, and Black Veterans of America intensified the gravity of the event, causing the entire nation to hold its breath with every testimony. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Isabella Rossi, famously known as the one who never backs down in cases against law enforcement. With over 12 courtroom victories involving police brutality, Rossi represented not just justice, but also the thousands of families who had suffered in silence. The defense, funded by the National Police Protection Association, a group notorious for denying the role of racial bias in shooting incidents, sought to portray Hansen as a victim, a high-pressure officer who lost the ability to discern in a life-or-death moment. They hired 3 psychologists to construct a narrative in which Hansen suffered from PTSD following an alleged on-duty assault, an ambiguous incident that was never confirmed by any medical record. Eudora Thompson, Felix's widow, attended court every day without fail. Their 2 sons, one a cadet at West Point, the other an active-duty Marine, wore full military dress uniforms as they sat beside their mother, faces devoid of rage, showing only the resolute strength of those who had once stood beneath the flag and sworn to defend the Constitution. Each day the trial proceeded, the U.S. Army sent a general or colonel to sit silently in the gallery, not to speak, not to interfere, but to silently signal, "We are watching to see whether justice will be betrayed." The evidence presented was so compelling that even neutral observers began to lean toward the truth. Security footage from a nearby home showed Felix standing still, arms slowly raised, before collapsing. Audio recording from Felix's phone, his voice calm and clear, stating, "I'm being detained without cause. I will call my lawyer." 3D forensic analysis, body motion simulations that confirmed Felix made no gesture resembling a weapon draw or any threatening movement. The most damning evidence came from the Oakmont Police Department's internal personnel records. In the past 5 years, Boniface Hansen had been subject to 3 separate racial bias complaints, including threatening to arrest a black high school student for wearing a hoodie, referring to an African Uber driver as a sneaky shadow over internal radio, and most notably, pointing a firearm at a 12-year-old boy holding a water gun, an incident that was buried following an off-record meeting. When Attorney Rossi played Felix's final words, "I will call my lawyer," the courtroom fell silent as a graveyard. A moment later, people began to weep, including 2 former police officers who had worked alongside Hansen. They were now testifying as witnesses against their one-time colleague. The trial was not yet over, but the message was already clear. This was no longer a simple prosecution. It had become a testimony before the conscience of a nation. And in that courtroom, Felix Thompson, though no longer alive, was finally being heard. 2 relentless weeks, nearly 40 witnesses, over 230 physical and digital pieces of evidence, and thousands of pages of documentation were presented in court. The trial, symbolic of an era in which America was forced to confront itself, reached its final chapter. On Deliberation Day, the 12 jurors, 7 women, 5 men, from diverse backgrounds and professions, were transported to a secured hotel under maximum protection. They had 72 hours to determine the fate of one man, and more than that, to decide whether justice still existed in America for people of color. On Tuesday morning, Oakmont County Court reopened after 2.5 days of waiting. More than 400 people gathered outside, many holding signs that read, "Justice for Felix. Color is not a crime. Don't salute the flag and shoot the soldier." Even those who had never known Felix Thompson came because they understood. Today was not just the judgment of a police officer, it was the judgment of centuries-old fear and prejudice. Inside the courtroom, the air was frozen. When the jury spokesperson, a white woman in her 50s, a high school teacher, stood, everyone rose. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice was sharp as a blade. "We find the defendant, Boniface Hansen, guilty of first-degree murder." A wave of silence crashed over the room. An officer seated in the back covered their mouth. A journalist collapsed in tears. Boniface Hansen, once a man who barked orders, once someone who treated the law like his shield, hung his head, hands shaking, speechless. He was no longer a man of the law. He was the defendant, and the nation was watching him. The sentencing phase began. Attorney Rossi, composed yet firm, stood and requested the highest penalty permitted under Virginia law: death by lethal injection. "We are not just sentencing a trigger puller," she said, eyes fixed on the jury. "We are sentencing a traitor. The badge on his chest should have symbolized protection, not masked murderous intent." The courtroom fell into absolute stillness. Her words were not meant to provoke hate, but to summon conscience. The defense attempted to introduce mitigating circumstances. Hansen grew up poor in Marlow, his father an alcoholic, his mother deceased early. He was bullied as a child for being soft. A history of mild anxiety disorder. 10 years serving in high-pressure environments. But Judge Gregory McCallan, who had lost a son in a bombing in Afghanistan, was unmoved. In his sentencing statement, he spoke not only with the authority of the bench, but from the heart of a father, a citizen, and a man who knew the cost of honor. Felix Thompson did not die by accident. He died from a deliberate choice, a shot fired from prejudice, hidden behind a badge. And when a badge becomes a tool for killing, it must bear responsibility like any weapon. He looked directly at Hansen, and for the first time did not read, but declared with finality, "The sentence of this court is death." No one moved for the first 5 seconds. Then a sob broke out, not from Eudora Thompson, but from a young female officer seated in the back of the room. Eudora was different. She didn't cry aloud. Her tears fell silently down her cheeks, her lips trembling, and then she tightened her grip on her 2 sons. It was the first time she cried not from pain, but because a measure of justice had been restored. Outside the courthouse, when the verdict was announced over the loudspeaker, hundreds applauded, not with shouting or cheering, but with a sustained, quiet round of applause that lasted nearly 2 minutes. It was a farewell to a soldier, and a vow to the living. We will not let his death fade into silence. With the death sentence handed to Boniface Hansen, the state of Virginia set an unprecedented standard. A police officer who kills out of racial bias must face the highest penalty. And Felix Thompson, now, was no longer just a fallen man. He was a milestone, a reckoning bell, a symbol of a truth that could never again be silenced. At the very moment the judge pronounced the words, "The sentence of this court is death," a new era, though fragile, was ushered into the judicial history of the United States. It wasn't merely the end of Boniface Hansen, but a seismic shock that rattled the deepest layers of a system long blinded by skin color. Within 24 hours of the verdict, the live stream of the sentencing across X, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook had garnered over 4.7 million views, making it the most watched trial in the past 5 years, second only to the presidential impeachment hearings. The hashtag #Felix verdict reached nearly 18 million mentions on the first night alone, accompanied by thousands of heartfelt messages from veterans, military families, and everyday citizens who had never believed that justice could truly exist for Black Americans. The President of the United States sent a handwritten letter to Felix Thompson's family, read aloud at a memorial service held 7 days later. Felix was more than a soldier. He was a mirror to America's conscience. His death was a wake-up call, not just for the system, but for all of us who've stayed silent for too long. Within the following week, the U.S. Department of Defense announced the creation of the Felix Thompson Memorial Fund, with an initial budget of $15 million, dedicated to scholarships and mental health support programs for children of veterans who had experienced racial discrimination. The fund's headquarters were established in Norfolk, Virginia, where Felix had been stationed during the final years of his career. As for the family, Eudora Thompson, the wife who never collapsed, emerged as a symbolic figure in police reform. She appeared at multiple congressional hearings, led community forums, and carried with her a chilling but undeniable message. "Don't let me be the last woman to stand over a coffin because of my husband's skin color." That slogan appeared on over 60,000 posters at protest marches throughout the following year. The mayor of Oakmont, under immense media scrutiny and public pressure, resigned on November 2nd. A broader investigation by the Department of Justice uncovered at least 42 complaints of discriminatory behavior within the Oakmont police force that had been ignored over the past 8 years. The FBI reopened those cases, and several previously missing files mysteriously resurfaced through anonymous submissions sent to Washington. In the same legislative season, 13 states simultaneously passed new statutes, the Felix Law, mandating all police officers to keep their body cams on during every civilian encounter. States like Illinois, Oregon, and Pennsylvania added further clauses. Turning off the body cam would henceforth be treated as intent to conceal. September 13th, the day Felix was shot, became a quiet symbol. Each year, veterans in at least 23 states hold small memorials. There are no grand processions, only a neatly folded flag, a solemn military hymn, and a photograph of a soldier who did not fall in battle, but to prejudice on the very soil he swore to defend. The media dubbed it the post-Felix era. Police academies began incorporating the case into their training curricula as a historic example of the cost of unchecked power. But amid all the reforms, declarations, and legacies, one question continued to ripple quietly, like a stain spreading in a cold glass of water. Felix Thompson received justice. But how many others, nameless, unrecorded, without a military ID in their wallet, have died in the shadows? And then, another question, colder, deeper, more brutal, still hung in the air. When will America stop shooting before it asks? Because the legacy of Felix is not one of sorrow. That legacy, above all, is a reminder that no one is allowed to forget. No one is allowed to stay silent. And no one is allowed to pull the trigger just because they fear a skin color. In the end, something did begin to change. Join us in sharing meaningful stories by hitting like and subscribing. Don't forget to turn on notifications to start your day with profound lessons and genuine empathy.